In this video, we're going to look at validation in Spring Boot. There are many ways that we can perform validation in a Spring Boot application. We could, for example, just write some boilerplate code with standard Java using if statements to check the data. But in Spring Boot, we can avoid much of that. We could use bean validation, which will involve putting in validation annotations on the fields for a class. We can use built-in validation using @validated and @valid annotations. And we can use a custom validator, which is really a class that implements the validator interface. And we'll be looking primarily at bean validation and the built-in validation. When we start an application at start.spring.io, we need to make sure that we use the validation dependency. And if we have an existing project, then we need to add this dependency into the pom.xml file. With bean validation, we will put one or more validation annotations against each field that needs to be validated. And here are some of the frequently used annotations: @NotNull, @NotBlank, and so on. These are pretty self-explanatory, so you don't need a detailed explanation of each. The point is that when an object of this class is validated, these annotations will define what kind of validation must be performed on each of the fields. So here's an example where we have an ID field, and we're saying that its minimum value is 1. In other words, if we were to try to put a 0 in that field, this validation would reject the value and generate an automatic error message. We can see here that title and author and ISBN, each one of them must not be blank. And with the number of copies, the minimum permitted value is 0. So you can see that these annotations make validation very readable. But bean validation is not automatic. Just because we've put those annotations into the bookDTO class does not mean that they will be validated. Here's an example. In the book REST controller, in the createBook method, we call the book service createBook method. And what we're doing is passing in a bookDTO object that has been created automatically from the data that came in as the request body as part of the post request. In book service, we're creating a new book object using the data in the bookDTO object and saving it via the repository in the database. That will return a book entity, which we convert back into a bookDTO via the factory method createDTO. So that bookDTO will go back to the createBook method and then is returned to the client. And here we can see a request of type post that passes in a JSON string, the fields of which contain invalid values. But the validation hasn't been done because these invalid values have now been inserted into the database. So no errors were detected because validation has not been invoked. To invoke the built-in validation process in Spring Boot, we need to make use of the @valid annotation. So we're now saying that the request body needs to be a valid bookDTO. And that will trigger the automatic injection of a validator that will validate the payload data that is sent as a bookDTO. And now that data will be validated using those validation annotations in the bookDTO class. And just by triggering the validation process, we now get a report that tells us that the request status is 400, which says this is a bad request. There's the message that says that. And it was on this particular request that we got this bad request status. So it doesn't actually tell us very much about what went wrong. We can also validate path variables. Here's an example of a get mapping that has got this path variable called ID. And you can see that in the endpoint method, we're identifying the path variable ID as being bound to the method parameter bookID. And we've introduced a validation annotation to say that to be considered valid, this path variable must have a value of 1 or more. And if there is an invalid value, this message will be associated with the error report. To trigger the validation of path variables, we need to annotate the class with the @validated annotation, and that will trigger the validation of path variables whenever there is a validation annotation. We can also have request parameters validated, and that's done in exactly the same way as with path variables. It's also possible to validate other components, such as services. We just annotate the class with @validated, and then annotate method parameters with @valid. And here's an example. In book service, we're saying that when we call the createBook method, the bookDTO object must be valid. And by putting @validated in front of the class declaration, this validation will be done. There's a lot more to this that needs to be considered. For example, having detected the validation, how do we report it? And that will be the subject of our next video. In the meantime, I think there is a lot of additional background reading that you could do. For example, if you go to this URL, you will find a lot of information about all the bean validation annotations. Also, there's more information about validation in Spring Boot that you can find from these two web addresses, and perhaps you should look particularly for validation groups, how to validate JPA entities, and also validating programmatically. And if you're using an HTML form for input, then you would want to take a look at this URL to see how to validate form input.